Good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's program with the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, The End of the World, Johannes Kelpius, Beliefs and Cosmology. My name is Selena Bemak, and I am the Programs and Communications Coordinator at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. HSP was founded in 1824 and proudly serves as Philadelphia's Library of American History with over 21 million manuscripts. Just a few housekeeping notes before we get started this evening. This program is being recorded tonight and it will be sent to you in a follow-up email along with the survey. I'm going to go ahead and enable closed captioning. There's a little live transcript button at the bottom. CC, live transcript is now turned on if you need closed captioning. We will have time for questions at the end of tonight's program. In the meantime, though, if you think of questions, go ahead and use the Q&A box or enter them into the chat. And speaking of the chat, please let us know where you are zooming in from tonight. We are zooming in here from Philadelphia, where it is very hot, like 100 degrees outside today. Another note, we are in webinar mode, which means we cannot see you and you cannot see each other. So again, if you would like to ask a question, just raise your hand or drop a question in the chat or the Q&A. And lastly, tonight's program is being held in collaboration with Fairmount Park Conservancy. They will be hosting their own Kelpius theme evening hike next Wednesday, August 10th. And you can register for that here if you would like to attend. I am dropping the link in the chat and I see you all entering where you are zooming in from tonight. All right, so without further ado, let's get started. So we are delighted to host Patrick Erben and Brad Mall tonight to talk about Johannes Kelpius. Brad Mall is a photographer and a writer with a focused eye on Philadelphia's environment, both man-made and natural. He lives in the Wissahickon, the part of Roxborough under Kelpius's long shadow. So Brad, if you'd like to come on screen, say hello, tell us about yourself and where you're zooming in from tonight.
I'm on camera. Hello, everybody. My name is Brad, and we are live at the Hermitage. The Hermitage is here in the Wissahickon. It is a house that, by some measures, was built on the grounds that Kelpius lived with his fellow hermits in the 1690s. I also just want to be clear that I am not a scholar. Patrick is a scholar. I'm just a Wissahickon buff who happens to be here. But the Hermitage exists now. The house was built in 1848. It came into the possession of the city of Philadelphia in 1895 and is a part of the Fairmount Park system. It is one of the historic houses throughout the city of Philadelphia. The park system, it is managed by the Fairmount Park Conservancy, who Selena just mentioned is a sort of co-host on this event and leading the hike next week. We see our friend Kelpius here, and in just a bit, we will go down to the Hermit's Cave and talk a little more about that. So I'll send it back to Selena and Patrick, and thanks for being here.
Thank you very much, Brad. That's really exciting. So like Brad just said, we will be seeing a live stream from the Kelpius Cave at the end of this program. But in the meantime, you're going to hear from Patrick Erben, who's a professor of English at the University of West Georgia. Patrick was born and raised in Germany, where he attended Johannes Gutenberg University in Mainz. He earned his PhD from Emory and completed a 2-year postdoc fellowship at the Alejandro Institute. And as a result, published his first book, A Harmony of the Spirits, Translation and the Language of Community in Early Pennsylvania, which earned the 2013 Dale W. Brown Book Award for Outstanding Scholarship in Anabaptist and Pietist Studies. So without further ado, I will let you take over, Patrick, and begin your presentation on Kelpius.
Thanks so much, Selena, for the kind introduction. Also, thanks so much to Justina for Barrett and everyone at the HSP for your invitation. So let me share my screen here real quick for my slideshow. All right, so The End of the World, Johannes Kelpius' Beliefs and Cosmology. Born in a German-speaking region of Transylvania in 1667, Johannes Kelpius from Germany in 1694. And he established a utopian community along Wissahickon Creek, about 6 miles from Philadelphia. His beliefs and practices, including meditation, celibacy, and asceticism, developed out of a Europe torn by war and religious strife. Kelpius and his followers called themselves the Society of the Woman in the Wilderness, following a passage from the book of Revelation, which you can see here. They hoped the physical wilderness would afford them refuge from the moral and spiritual wilderness of 17th century Europe. But what draws us to Johannes Kelpius, the enigmatic mystic of early Pennsylvania today? Why and how did Kelpius and his followers seek comfort and salvation in mysticism? I invite you to consider what Kelpius's otherworldly visions may offer 21st century Americans seeking respite themselves from social conflict, political partisanship, environmental disasters, global pandemics, and the sharp contrast between material excess and economic precarity. Now, first, a few clarifications are in order. Kelpius was no end-time prophet or bizarre fanatic in the vein that we might imagine if we watch National Geographic's Doomsday Preppers or know about any sort of well-known cult leaders of the 21st century. In my considerations, I will disregard legends, not that they don't matter, but I will not at least discuss legends about whether he was in possession of the Philosopher's Stone or had magical knowledge, and what mysterious ceremonies he and his followers performed at the famed hermitage and tabernacle. Rather, I'm drawn to his radical willingness to renounce most of what his contemporaries valued. Like Kelpius in the 17th century, we are shocked by the partisanship, ostentatiousness, hypocrisy, and distractions of our own time. Yet we refuse to make necessary changes. Looking at us probingly, if you look at the portrait that was painted by Christopher Witt, one of his associates in 1705, Kelpius seems to ask, what if we too left behind everything? So briefly, of course, you don't need me to remind you of the issues that are weighing on our collective psyche today in the United States and across the globe. But simply to mention a few to then also situate ourselves in connection to 17th century Europe. Of course, the war in Ukraine has shaken our confidence of a stable geopolitical order. The COVID-19 pandemic has taken millions of lives, and even in the developed world has really acquainted us with disease and suffering. The pandemic has also eroded human relationships and degraded trust in policymakers or authorities. Again, something that Kelpius and his followers would have been intimately or keenly aware of. Also, the newly inflamed culture wars and clashes between democratic and authoritarian regimes have split discourses and even have created rifts through families and friendships. In the US, gun violence is destroying entire communities, and ultimately environmental degradation, especially climate change, depicted here, has even, made real the specter of human extinction. Now, if you feel at this moment that the talk is becoming very dark very quickly, and you wonder why you signed up, I'd like you to hang on a little bit longer. In order to understand Kelpius's world and explore any meaningful connections to our own predicament, we must also situate ourselves in the Central Europe of the late 17th century. Most importantly, Kelpius was born in 1667, when the Peace of Westphalia that ended the 30 Years' War was only 19 years old. The 30 Years' War had really depopulated vast stretches of Central Europe, and there were estimations that some regions lost between 1/3 and 1/2 of their population. Now, depicted here in this painting, mercenaries especially exerted a high toll on civilian population, yet nevertheless territorial rulers still pressed impoverished populations with heavy taxes and military service. Next, when Louis XIV emerged as one of the power brokers of that post-war order, he staged numerous invasions, especially of the border regions in the Palatinate, where later many of the German immigrants in Pennsylvania would come from. You can see here in this image the Schloss, or the castle of Heidelberg, and the city of Heidelberg, along with its castle, was sacked several times between 1688 and 1693. On the eastern border of the Habsburg Empire, of course, we had the Ottomans sieging Vienna, and in spite of the eventual victory of the Allied forces there, Europe was really afraid of the possibility of an Islamic invasion. Now, in the more religious realm, it was important that Louis XIV also in 1685 revoked the Edict of Nantes, which had granted toleration to Huguenots and other Protestants, and it really raised the specter of forced Catholicism. And ultimately, while the, sorry, that was a little too quick here. While the Peace of Westphalia had ended the 30 years war and actually inscribed and created tolerance for the three major denominations, Catholicism, Lutheranism, and Reformed, religious dissidents depended on the whims and good graces of territorial princes. Not unlike our own time, late 17th century Europe really witnessed large swaths of populations migrating in search for peace, toleration, and better economic conditions. Now let's return to Kelpius. It was, of course, no small wonder, given these situations, that many people in the late 17th century looked for the underlying reasons for such tribulations, and they also tried to devise utopian schemes for escaping an impending apocalypse. We know relatively little about Kelpius's childhood, but we know that he studied theology in three famous universities in Germany, Tübingen, Leipzig, and eventually Altdorf outside of Nuremberg. And we can imagine how he was fascinated by the many spiritualist, ecstatic, and secretive theories of religious and social change circulating on the continent. Especially popular among religious seekers were explanations for the separation of human knowledge from divine wisdom during the fall in paradise, which had led humanity to become disunited from God and from each other. Remedies thus entailed the search for keys to secret knowledge that would allow access to divine wisdom and a renewal of human society. For the famous Czech linguist and educator Jan Amos Comenius, the key lay in overcoming the linguistic separation wrought by the confusion of languages at Babel. So he created multilingual handbooks, such as his, quote, Gate of Tongues Unlocked and Opened, which featured several European languages side by side to demonstrate their larger unity. Comenius hoped to create a perfect language, or panglottia, that would be spoken by all humankind. Such a desire for perfect, comprehensive, and universal knowledge also motivated the publication and subsequent frenzy over the Rosicrucian manifestos in the early 1600s. As you can see here, the title page of the first manifesto, the Fama Fraternitatis in 1614, promised, quote, the universal and general reformation of the whole wide world, and offered to share the fraternity's knowledge with, quote, all the scholars and heads of state in Europe, who would then undertake their universal program of social, intellectual, and religious transformation. Characteristically, the Fama claimed that this knowledge was based on the discoveries of a medieval traveler named Christian Rosenkreuz, who had found a manuscript encapsulating the key to such universal knowledge. Although in hindsight, the Rosicrucian manifestos have been accepted by most scholars as the invention of the German theologian and mystic Johann Valentin André, the excitement they created across Europe was no hoax. People deeply desired what the second manifesto alluded to, quote, wouldn't it be a precious thing if you could find, read, and understand and remember in one book everything contained in all the books that have ever been or will be written or published, unquote. Whether Kelpius and his fellow hermits practiced Rosicrucian principles is besides the point. What matters most is that he and similar religious seekers yearned for access to a lost or hidden divine knowledge that would once more unite God and humanity, and humans with each other. Kelpius and the people he met during his studies and travels in the 1680s looked desperately for a way out of the endless cycles of war and religious strife. Many of them had become disillusioned with the main Protestant denominations and despaired of their ability to renew society based on true Christian piety. Associated originally with reformist Protestant church figures such as Philipp Jakob Spener and August Hermann Franke. So I need to move this here if it's covered up, his face there, that's a statue in Halle where he built his famous institutes. The movement known as Pietism became inflected by a radicalism eventually that rejected most institutional religions and church doctrines, cultivating instead a deeply emotional and personal relationship between individuals and Christ. Here, Kelpius's journey becomes intertwined with a movement toward religious renewal, sweeping through German-speaking territories. One of the most important influences on Kelpius and this movement was the early 17th century mystic and shoemaker Jakob Böhme, who claimed divine visions as the inspiration for his extensive writings, including his Aurora, or in German, Morgenröte, and his Mysterium Magnum. Böhme's emphasis on the practice of piety and the individual experience of and union with the divine became one of the driving forces of pietism. Most importantly, Böhme argued that human languages still maintain vestiges of the divine essence from which they had ostensibly become divided at the Tower of Babel. For anyone like Kelpius invested in Böhme's ideas, the quest was to access the divine essence buried under the dross of church doctrine, the power of the clergy, and human desires for self-glorification. Such ideas blatantly challenged both secular and religious authorities, as you can imagine, with radical pietists and devotees of Böhme regularly becoming stateless and churchless pariahs. Let me move this again. Though the date and time of Kelpius meeting the ousted Lutheran minister Johann Jakob Zimmermann are unknown, their affinity changed the rest of young Kelpius's life. Zimmermann had actually spouted ideas of Böhme's as a pastor of a mainstream Lutheran church in Southwest Germany, which really got him in trouble with the church and also the state authorities. He had also published astronomical tracts on the appearance of two large comets, the Great Comet of 1680 and the Comet of 1682, which would eventually be named Halley's Comet. Now, Zimmermann's observations were actually scientifically correct, as he, for example, proved Johannes Kepler's laws of the elliptical orbits of planets. But it got interesting when it came to Zimmermann's interpretation, which were heavily tinged by the sort of millennialism of other radical pietists who believed that the comets really predicted the second coming of Christ and the beginning of his 1,000-year rule on Earth. So the comets were also threatening, according to Zimmermann and others, the destruction of Europe, which he and a group of devotees would then escape. Zimmermann moved his wife and family to Hamburg, which he thought was more tolerant to his ideas, and most likely he met Kelpius and other followers in that city. He organized his so-called chapter of perfection, and he and this group then planned to emigrate to America via the city of Rotterdam, where he hoped to arrange for the passage, purchase land from William Penn's agents, and ultimately found his society there. Now, unfortunately, Zimmermann never made it. He died of unknown causes in Rotterdam, and the group selected Kelpius as their new leader, most likely because he was already thought to be the spiritual successor of Zimmermann all along. Now, unfortunately, the mystics' money ran out very quickly. They could only travel to London. And there they raised or tried to raise money among Quakers who were actually very sympathetic towards the radical religious ideas of the group. Yet, unfortunately, the time in London also presaged for Kelpius worse things to come. When, they kind of fell for the common pitfalls that plague many communal or utopian experiments, sort of falling into internal strife and dissension. What you can see here is a page of his diary and also letter book that's today housed at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. And in a segment here, he accounted for the group's, or at least part of the group's, depraved manners and wasting their time in brawls and fights, which were a scandal even to the lower sailors, who wondered that the young women in the group were beaten by the men. So Kelpius's diary here already reveals a glaring discrepancy between him and a portion of the group who took apparently the loss of social controls as an incentive to repeat rather than relinquish the moral ills of the society they left behind. Kelpius therefore urged a quick departure for America because he felt that London, the big city, was just corrupting everybody. And he pegged this hope on the physical removal to the American wilderness. Now, the presence of several young unmarried women, as well as wives and children, demonstrates that the principle of celibacy among the society of the woman in the wilderness was probably not accepted until later. Rather than a fully formed ideology and spiritual program, Kelpius's later mystical and aesthetic lifestyle on the Wissahickon emerged in response to both his evolving roles, but also in response to changing social and cultural environments. Next, while in London, Kelpius and his group also made contact with the so-called Philadelphian Society, which was a spiritualist, non-denominational group led by the illustrious Jane Lead, who functioned as their veritable prophetess. The Philadelphians also promoted an ecumenical notion of overcoming religious strife, which is something that Kelpius and his group were attracted to. In the back of his diary, which you can see here on the left, is actually something like almost like an address list, and he recorded the address of Francis Lee, who was also a prominent member of the Philadelphian Society, and he stayed in touch with these members, especially later the German-speaking Johann Heinrich Deichmann. We'll hear more about him soon. Now, Kelpius and his followers, once they arrived in the city of Philadelphia, you can see here kind of like the famous grid layout on the left and on the right, from Christoph Sauer's Almanac, a scene that portrays the arrival of a German immigrant. The group arrived in 1694, and of course, much has been made by the fact that the millennium, as we know, did not arrive that year as Zimmermann had originally predicted. And some writers have actually attributed the rising disagreements among the group to frustrations about their unfulfilled end times expectations. Yet the non-arrival of the millennium, likely played, I think, only a minor role in the group's rising troubles. Instead, several members took issue, surprise, with the idea of celibacy. For example, Daniel Faulkner was apparently already excommunicated by his elder Heinrich Bernhard Köster because he was supposedly striking up a relationship with the notorious prophetess of Erfurt, Anna Maria Schuchard, even on the ship before they arrived. Also, it was kind of a misfortune for the mystics that they came after the Keith schism had already started raging among Pennsylvania Quakers since 1692. And it really also brought that kind of dissension to the hermits themselves. Köster, for example, preached among the Quakers, and he eventually became involved with George Keith's faction and eventually returned to Germany to take up life as a Lutheran minister. One of Kelpius's closest allies, Johann Gottfried Selig, also joined the fray by writing a report to German pietists slamming the Quakers' principles of faith and supposedly lack of biblical knowledge. So you kind of have to imagine this as some of his associates already airing the dirty laundry of what was going on in Germany. And so there was a well-known awareness of what was happening, and we can kind of imagine Kelpius himself becoming frustrated and disillusioned. Now, the irony, I think, of what was happening, I think, should be apparent. Individuals who were radical critics of the established Protestant churches back in Germany suddenly found themselves in a religious environment that actually exceeded their own expectation for how radical one could be. So they suddenly, or at least some of the members of the group suddenly started wondering whether the dissolution of religious authority in favor of an ill-defined faith was actually the answer to European problems. In America, the Hermits discovered a much broader spectrum of religious beliefs and forms of expression, and their stance of opposition to Orthodox Protestantism apparently wasn't enough to give them a coherent communal identity. So I really imagine Kelpius at a crossroads here, facing a dilemma that perhaps many of us who are trying to be engaged in various social, cultural, environmental, or political causes are also acquainted with. So I think he was asking himself, should he fully dedicate himself to building and leading a movement along with the pitfalls that such a course entails, especially the loss of spiritual peace and his own inner quietude? Or should he uncompromisingly live according to his spiritual principles, especially in jettisoning human power and social influence? So in a letter that he wrote in 1697 to Heinrich Deichmann in London, Kelpius reflected on the stark contrast between his utopian expectations in coming to America and the reality he encountered. Quote, "I went with joy to this desert as into a garden of roses, and I knew not at that time that it was a furnace of affliction in which the Lord was about to purify and to prove me," unquote. Seemingly expressing his disappointment, Kelpius, I think in reality here announced his choice to accept both outward and inward suffering as conduits to perfection. Kelpius devised a type of preparationism for spiritual perfection that included a lifestyle of physical self-denial and even an abandonment of an active striving for a union with Christ. In the brand of mysticism he embraced only a passive relinquishment of all human desires, which he frequently likened to the forlorn cooing of the turtle dove for its lost partner, could make the imperfect human acceptable to Christ the Redeemer. In some ways, therefore, the early troubles sparked by unbending ideologues like Cresta were ironically what Kelpius needed. They helped form the three main focuses of the smaller group that remained around Kelpius until his death in 1708. First, I'd like to talk about his radical inwardness and system of spiritual perfection that Kelpius called the three wilderness states. Second, he and his associates developed an intense poetic and musical productiveness that led to the composition and translation of scores of mystical hymns sung by members and also spread among congenial individuals beyond the hermits. And third, the establishment of a system of meditation culminating in Kelpius's own prayer manual entitled A Short, Easy, and Comprehensive Method of Prayer. Now, it's difficult to determine what ideas and directions Kelpius articulated directly to the members of his group. We can really mostly rely only on his writings, such as his letters. In those letters, Kelpius identified as the first step on his spiritual path the acknowledgement of his own imperfection. He was apparently in touch with the Swedish Lutheran pastor Eric Björk in Christina, Delaware, to whom he wrote kind of almost like an internal dialogue with himself. So he wrote, or he said, "How happeneth it, my Kelpius, that unto thy God, so love-worthy, so rich, so liberal, and in endless ways transcending thine every desire, in these least things and temporal affairs and perishable things and foreign things, in external and transitory things, not to say eternal and spiritual, I say in these, thou hast not hitherto shown the acme of perfection and scarcely showest it even now." So in other words, to sum up, he really was unhappy with himself that even in the most basic expectations of renouncing those things, he couldn't even find perfection. So then in a 1706 letter to the traveling Quaker minister Esther Palmer of Flushing, Long Island, Kelpius then identified this first level as the barren wilderness. The actual wilderness of Pennsylvania, however, constituted for him the physical environment best suited to move to the second level, the fruitful wilderness, which would be achieved by human beings who dedicated themselves to an arduous process of spiritual perfection and who relinquished most outward trappings of human desire. In other words, all the things that we mostly worry about, like food, clothing, money, sex, entertainment, and so forth. So, back to Kelpius's portrait here. I think this painting already signposts for us this very approach. We see a room, perhaps a cave, devoid of any objects or ornaments except a chair, table, book, and a clock that served both as a memento mori, a reminder of the fleeting nature of human lives, and as a veiled reference to the painter, Christopher Witt, who was also a known master clockmaker. Kelpius's personal appearance is that of a poor scholar, and his features are thin and his body language and facial expression are cerebral. His left hand, raised to his temple, could serve as a gesture to his dedication to inwardness, but also as pointing toward the highest, third level of spiritual perfection, which he called the wilderness of the elect of God, which was essentially identical with the perfect union with divine wisdom. Now, he believed that he had not reached that and that only individuals like Moses or the Apostle Paul had reached that level. At least striving for ascendancy to the second or fruitful wilderness, Kelpius considered the continual weakening of his personal health as a sign of the erosion of his carnal nature, and thus actually his transformation to a higher spiritual state. In the same letter to Esther Palmer, he thus stated, quote, "And so the divine virtue of the Almighty is perfected in mine infirmity," unquote. In one of his hymn texts, moreover, he actually identified himself while writing the hymn as, quote, "Lying in Christian Warner's house, very weak in a small bed, not unlike a coffin, in May 1706, unquote. In a religious paradox, the physical weakness of the earthly body best equipped the longing soul for its union with Christ. Now, the oft-mentioned nighttime watchfulness of the hermits may have primarily served as a physical analog of each individual's waiting for the arrival of the bridegroom, Christ, which was often equated with the morning star. So if you look at the hymnals that Kelpius and his associates wrote, some of them actually included hymns already well-known and popular in Germany. They include, for example, hymns like Philipp Nicolai's "How Brightly Shines the Morning Star" and "Awake Resounds the Voice," which are directed to the morning star. Kelpius and his core associates, especially the English physician, botanist, and clockmaker Christopher Witt, also engaged, therefore, in a flurry of hymn writing and composing activities. So many of them are actually originally written hymns. Probably the most unique example is the HSP's bilingual hymnal, which in German is called Die klägliche Stimme der verborgenen Liebe, and in English, The Lamenting Voice of the Hidden Love. Kelpius and Witt compiled, composed, and translated this hymnal, proclaiming the group's mystical longings for Christ as the, quote, "loving moan of a disconsolate soul, secluded in literal and spiritual wilderness." The volume's most notable quality, as you can see here, is its dialogic design, with the German hymns on the left and the English translation on the right. And I think that this design actually mirrored the bilingual composition of his own group, who included also English-speaking individuals like Witt, but it also more mystically referenced the uniting of seemingly disunited voices. Now, Kelpius never actually sought publication of these hymns, but various manuscripts can be found in archives in Pennsylvania that show that there was actually quite a good bit of demand for these hymns outside of the hermit's inner circle. Also, I would say that it's notable that Kelpius seems to have brought, sorry, there was kind of a little sign here. I want to make sure that's not, okay. Make sure it wasn't necessarily about my timing. So you can kind of see that he and his associates actually brought German hymnody to North America way before famous publications like Jacobi Salmodia Germanica was published in America in 1756. Finally, sorry, that was a little too far here. Kelpius focused his time of withdrawal and inwardness on developing a mystical method of communicating with God, and he published this, or it was published eventually as in German as kurzer Begriff oder leichtes Mittel zu beten oder mit Gott zu reden. Although a printed edition may have been published before Kelpius's death by the Philadelphia German printer Renier Janssen, the first extant edition, as you can see here, or pictured here, was published in 1756 and was followed soon by 2 English translations. In his prayer manual, Kelpius follows the mystical ideal of the via negativa, which is the belief that to achieve mystical union with God, individual believers must abandon an active pursuit of divine knowledge, especially of making mental images of God. Kelpius reminds readers, quote, how necessary it is not to suffer any thoughts to enter into the mind, neither good nor bad, to be free from all figures and images in order to perform the inward prayer, unquote. Like a state of spiritual martyrdom, inward prayer must result in a complete abandoning of all self-will and result in a perfect submission to God. The soul, according to Kelpius, in this state reached a, quote, state of inward silence in its abandonment to the 3 Christian virtues, faith, hope, and love. For Kelpius, the true language of the soul was one of complete silence. That means a freedom from the vain human pursuit of making imperfect signifiers to capture the perfect essence of God. Kelpius considered his revocation of society and abandonment of his human self-will, even in illness and death, the spiritual liberation of the human soul and of its original divine language. In that language, true communication with God was once again possible. Sorry, a little too quick here. Lastly, I would like to consider here Kelpius and his present day relevance for us. What, you may wonder at this point, does the curious story of Johannes Kelpius really have to do with the anxieties and fears of our own time? How do his renunciations and inward stance help us confront issues of today? Now, to sum up briefly, Kelpius' story centers on migration and thus the abandonment of what he and others identified as the European Babylon. In the process, Zimmermann and then Kelpius gathered a group of like-minded individuals. When the group's quarrels with each other and the immediate socio-religious context led to examples of proud self-will, Kelpius tried to steer clear of the common pitfalls of the power residing in leadership positions. Yet we may be uninspired by Kelpius because he did not try to save the world, and he did not even try to save himself. Rather, he fully subscribed to the mystical paradox that any active pursuit of divine union or knowledge automatically disqualified the individual from becoming the perfect bride of Christ. Now, granted, all this may seem too precious, strange, or irrelevant for the harsh realities we're facing today. Yet I see Kelpius as a radical countercultural figure whose baffling actions are indispensable for putting pressure on the often self-righteous assumptions that drive our engagement with contemporary problems. Kelpius' self-deprecating stance reminds us that we cannot affect change or deal with our uncertainties if we prioritize winning an argument or garnering support for ourselves, rather than for the issue that we care so deeply about. In many ways, Kelpius was the anti-Thoreau, Henry David Thoreau. Unlike the famous Concord writer who lived and wrote about his stay at Walden Pond, Kelpius, in fact, did write an ode to dejection. Thoreau said he wasn't writing an ode to dejection. Whereas Thoreau created this experiment to challenge his contemporaries to a better life, Kelpius first challenged himself and those who voluntarily joined him. Yet both Thoreau and Kelpius ultimately urge us to examine ourselves and our own choices as perhaps the very source of our dilemmas, or at least as obstacles to the solution. Admittedly, abandoning self-will is the opposite of the self-care creed that we hear preached so often, especially in the wake of the pandemic. But what if Kelpius was right, and only by emptying ourselves from desires and even image making can we free ourselves from the attachments that stand in the way of change? The person looking at us from Witt's portrait was no misanthrope wanting to be left alone. He seems to invite us to join him in probing, questioning, and ultimately abandoning what we hold dear. The person in this portrait knows we have a hard time doing just that because he himself had been there. He nevertheless tells us that to face our uncertainties and fears, we must first examine ourselves and our own choices. Thank you so much for hanging there with me. And I would like to turn this over to, turn this back over to Selena.
Thank you so much, Patrick. That was excellent. That was amazing. And we do have some comments in the chat. But before we get to that, right here, you can see on the screen is an overhead view of the Wissahickon Valley. And so it's really a forest within a city. And so you can see the little green speck. That's where it says Hermit's Cave. That is where Brad Mall and Justina Barrett from the Historical Society of Pennsylvania are right now. And they will be taking you on a live tour of the cave.
Hey, everybody. Can you see me okay? Can you see me and hear me okay?
I can hear you,
Okay.
and I can see you.
All right,
Thanks.
excellent. Thank you. First of all, Patrick, thank you very much for that. That was excellent. And as Selena mentioned, we are here in the Wissahickon Valley Park. And so this right here is what is known as the Hermit's Cave. Was it Kelpius's cave? We don't know for sure. We really don't know for sure. Some people say definitively that it is. Some people say definitively that it is not. We don't know for sure. But what you can see is that it is cave-like. It is a cave-like structure, clearly man-made. And so colloquially, culturally, semi-historically, this is the Hermit's Cave. And this part of the park came into the Fairmount Park possession in 1895 along with the Hermitage and the grounds. And so there are hiking trails around here. Lincoln Drive is within earshot here. I-76, the Schuylkill Expressway is about a mile from here. But back to this, whether or not it is Kelpius's cave, I don't know that we'll ever know. And also want to say hello to the Kelpius Society, many whose members are in attendance tonight. They also have thoughts on this space and this area altogether. But it is here, and it has been here. It has been here since the park system was created in the 1860s. And again, this exact area here was incorporated into the park system in the 1890s. And it has been referred to as the Hermit's Cave. The Hermit's Spring is over here somewhere. As you can see, everything is overgrown. This is the Wissahickon is a second growth forest. So all of this stuff is pretty new. There are not that many old growth trees in the Wissahickon. And a lot of this stuff is invasive vines, invasive plants and such. But there is a spring over here somewhere. So, again, colloquially, culturally, historically, that is the Hermit's Spring. And if you follow its path all the way down to where it enters the Wissahickon Creek, that area down there is a paved bike trail. And there's a bench down there, and you can kind of see how this little stream forms a delta as it enters the Wissahickon Creek. That is known as the Hermit's Glen. So these are all things historically that you can see on maps and, dating back to definitely the 1800s. But this, maybe it dates back to the 1600s, and maybe it was State. There was an older house called Lauriston Cottage that was just up the hill here. And it's very possible that this was a root cellar. But for our purposes, it is the Hermit's Cave. So we can take a look inside. Can you still see and hear me okay?
I can hear you, Brad. It's a
I
little
hope so.
dark now.
It is dark. There are no lights in the Hermit's Cave. But you can see that it's sort of an arched ceiling. So it's an arched ceiling. There's a wall back here. All of the stone here is Wissahickon schist. This is the native stone, the bedrock under Philadelphia. And incidentally, you can see right here, there are the remnants of a recent to-do here. I don't know what it was, but it's evidence that this spot does still mean a lot spiritually to a lot of people. There are definitely vibes in the Hermit's Cave and around this area. And so people come here to meditate or to have ceremonies, rituals, what have you. And you can see there are stones and bricks in the shape of a heart. There are little pieces, there are dried roses and other plants. There is a drawing, a cutout of a geisha, and there are two poems here. And this is not a prop. We did not put this here. But it's just evidence that people do still come here and they get in touch with themselves and the world at large. And then over here is another piece of evidence that shows how important this spot is historically. This tablet it's a Rosicrucian monument, and Patrick alluded to that a little bit. The sort of association and whether or not it's even important in terms of the Kelpius story, but certainly the Rosicrucians. The modern day Rosicrucians hold this place in high regard. Should I read it? Sure, it's short. So it says, Johannes Kelpius, PhD, AD 1673 to 1708, the contented of the God-loving soul, magister of the first Rosicrucian Amorc colony in America, which arrived in Philadelphia, June 24th, 1694, then known as the Monks of the Ridge. Brother Kelpius used this cave as a shelter and as a sanctum for his meditations. And then this tablet, lovingly erected to his memory by Grand Lodge Rosicrucians, AD 1961. So this has been here for over 60 years, in cooperation with the Supreme Grand Lodge Amorc. So there you go. What am I missing? Am I missing anything? Does anybody have any questions about this space here? I guess just to reiterate, this is on a hiking trail in the Wissahickon Park. It is part of the Philadelphia Parks and Recreation park system. And specifically here in the Wissahickon, the Friends of the Wissahickon are the great stewards of this park, and they will be turning 100 in just 2 years. So they were founded in 1924, and they are the great stewards of this beautiful park. If you're not a member, I recommend checking them out, fow.org. But yeah, beyond that. Oh yes, and of course you can come and see this next week when we do a hike with Fairmount Park Conservancy, and this will be the main attraction. You can see it here in person. So now, any questions here, or send it back to Selena?
Yes, I will take it back over. And
thank you very much.
Thank you, Brad. The hike with Fairmount Park Conservancy next week is actually an evening hike. So along with Kelpius's mysticism, there's maybe a little bit of a spooky, labyrinthy element to that as well. So we do have some questions in the chat and the Q&A for both Brad and Patrick. So I'm just going to scroll back, and let's start with a question from Catherine. And this is for Patrick about the Kelpius portrait. Could he be holding his eye open from ptosis? Droopy eye.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question, and I would appreciate, I mean, if you know anything about other references to that medical condition, as Kelpius suffering from that, but I don't know of any confirmation there, but certainly that's possible. When we were speaking about this program leading up to today, I was also sharing sort of like the idea that you know, for shamans in Central American cultures, traditionally, they were represented with these slot eyes when they were under the influence of some kind of hallucinogenics, which meant that in those moments they could actually transcend sort of limitations of the human body and space and time. So I really have no idea if that's in any way alluded to. I also do not have any evidence of the use of hallucinogenics among the hermits, but I find it interesting that that's a sort of like slightly half open eyes or lowered eyelids reminds me of shamans. So
interesting. Thank you. The next question is from the Q&A from Robert, and it's for Brad. It looks like concrete around the entrance. When was that added?
Well, so this part here, as we understand it, was original, and it's funny. Patrick and I were talking a little bit ahead of time. There's a book by Julius Saxta, and I don't want to say that it is a gospel by any means, but it has lots of interesting information in that sort of 19th century scholar way, where some things are cited and some things are not. But in that book, he talks about this being definitively Kelpius's cave. And that during the era of the Hermitage, after the Hermitage was built in the 1840s, one of the residents of this, and this is definitely true, was Benjamin Chew, the son of Benjamin Chew, the builder of Cliveden, the site of the Battle of Germantown. So the younger Benjamin Chew, there was some sort of rift in the family, and he came and stayed here. And evidently, because of this association with Kelpius, this was a popular place for people to come. And so supposedly Benjamin Chew, during his era living at the Hermitage, had this part put on, and you can kind of see that that it was later. You can see there's I mean, you can see the line here. So there's the line here and the line here.
Connection's a little spotty. Okay, well, I think we lost Brad for a moment. But let's hope they come back. I mean, I guess that's bound to happen when you are on your phone in the middle of the woods.
There is mortar, yes, the big slabs of Wissahickon schist. At some point there was a testing. No good?
Good, thank you.
We're good? Am I on?
Yes.
Did we hear the gate part?
We did not hear the gate part. Can you repeat that?
Oh, sure. Yeah. So yeah, I was just saying, like, so this part was added later. So probably in the probably like the 1860s, maybe 1870s, something like that. And so you have these schist slabs, and then there's one little iron piece here and another place where there was a drill. So there was most likely an iron gate that was here. And that was put here just kind of in response to the popularity of this place within the park system.
Great, thank you, Brad. And shameless plug, because you mentioned Benjamin too. Of course, the Chu family papers are held at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, if you want to learn more about the Chu family. So we only have a few more minutes for questions. Interesting question here for Patrick. Did Weissel pick up the turtle dove reference from that passage mentioned? And did the Ephrata choir ever perform any of Kelpius's hymns, or only Weissel's?
Oh, the latter part is really intriguing. I would say, to start with that, don't know. I don't think so. At least I don't have any evidence that they performed Kelpius's hymns, but it's widely accepted that Weissel had heard of Kelpius's experiment and that he was motivated to move to Pennsylvania because he in fact still assumed that some of the hermits were living around there. And I think the longest living was Conrad Mattei, I believe, that when Weissel came, Mattei would still been alive. I would have to look up his life dates. There was also a question about some other hermits still living in caves later on. Maybe one person to add to the names that you already mentioned was Daniel Geisler, who, the story goes, apparently then later on met Heinrich Melchior Mühlenberg and told him the story about the Philosopher's Stone and all of that. So he would have apparently still been alive, at least in 1742 there as well. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you. Yeah, so we're definitely not going to get to all of the questions because there are really some great ones. I just want to point out that Kirby in the chat put a playlist for all Kelpius related videos on YouTube. So that will be a great resource. Jack asks, Patrick, can you speak about their musical practices in worship, not just the vocal hymns, but the instruments they brought with them to Pennsylvania?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So there are other sources also from the Swedish Lutheran Church in Christiana, for example, that talks about the hermits visiting there and attending services to play their instruments. And I could be slightly wrong, but I do believe at least that they brought an organ, a small organ, and some brass instruments like trombones. I don't know, I've at least not seen any references to the group using those instruments in performing their own hymns. I would really love to see some descriptions about how those hymns were sung, how they were staged, and really any of the circumstances surrounding hymnody there. So I think that's an excellent question, and I'd love for some more research to give us more information there. So thank you, Jack, that's an excellent question.
All right, we have time maybe for one more question. So from Danielle, did Kelpius study Eastern philosophy? His practices remind me of Buddhist monks. It's an interesting perspective.
Yeah, I think there's some interesting convergence there, perhaps without direct influence, that I do think, I don't have any evidence that he studied this, but I do think that some of the theosophy or Sophism also that was circulating in the 17th century in Europe has many affinities to Buddhist or generally Eastern philosophy, and but I'm not sure if there's a direct influence. I think that's a fantastic subject of study. So if you want to take that up, I would love that.
Yeah, that's very niche, but it's interesting, it's fascinating. So we are just about out of time, but Patrick did put his contact information in the chat if you would like to reach out with him with any additional questions that we didn't get to. Thank you, Patrick and Brad. This was excellent, a great program. I love, Brad, that you're there on site in the Wissahickon, like live from the cave, the supposed cave, and it really was great. So just a few things, like I said, this program was recorded and it will be sent out. We will also be sending everybody a quick survey if you could complete that. Thank you everyone for attending. It is always great to have you here at our programs. A special thank you to our members. And I'm about to dump a bunch of links into the chat. So I'm including a link if you want to learn more about HSP's program or ongoing news. You can subscribe to our newsletter. I'm also including a link to Fairmount Park Conservancy's hike next week, Friends of Wissahickon if you're interested in membership, and to both of Patrick's publications. So thank you very much, and I will see everyone at our next program, I hope. Thank you, Patrick and Brad. Good night.
Good night. Thanks, everyone.
So long, everybody.